In 1969, George joined the Delaney and Bonnie and Friends tour. Not playing live since 1966, George was getting the urge to perform again. Once he got back on the stage, he had forgotten how good it felt. While on the tour, George wrote the song My Sweet Lord. This song became the first single of George's first solo album, All Things Must Pass. His fans reacted greatly to the album. It went to #1 on both the British and the US charts. The album also meant that he didn't need the Beatles anymore to be famous. He was now independent. In 1971, George was asked by his Indian sitar master and friend Ravi Shankar if he would like to do a benefit concert. Together, along with other famous musicians, they formed the Concert for Bangladesh. The first charity concert of its kind, all proceeds would go to refugees of the horrible war between East and West Pakistan. George wrote the song Bangladesh especially for the occasion. Soon after, George started recording his next solo album, Living in the Material World. After having some troubles with his producer, he decided to produce the album himself. It was also a hit and was an album in which his religious influence was really heard. Even though his music was a success, George was beginning to feel depression once again. He felt lonely, sad, and simply not happy. So, as always, he turned to his music for comfort. Soon afterward, he met Olivia Trinidad Arias. They were in close contact and George soon fell in love with her. The next 2 albums that George released were essentially a failure. Since he wrote them during a time of depression and while he was terribly sick, the albums didn't come out so great. He would even get booed during his performances. This broke him down both physically and emotionally. He was becoming weak and he was constantly suffering depression. In 1976, he started collaborating with the infamous comedy group Monty Python. He wrote some of the 2 songs featured in their shows, like the Lumberjack song. This experience sure livened up his spirit. George was now working on his next studio album, 33 1/3. After his previous musical disaster, people thought he would never return to the industry, but he sure proved them wrong. 33 1/3 turned out to be another hit. On June 1977, George and Patty were officially divorced. George was completely lighthearted about it. He thought of it as just another chip off his shoulder. They were legally married for 13 years. Just months later, Olivia announced that she was pregnant. This filled George with pure joy and excitement, and it inspired him to write his next self-titled album. This album showed just how happy he was to start a new phase in his life. Olivia and George welcomed their new son into their lives on August 1st, 1978. They named him Danny, which means wealthy in Sanskrit. Days later, Eric Clapton and Patty were married. In George's mind, all things had passed and new experiences were welcome. In 1980, John Lennon was assassinated. This event really struck George. Not only had he lost a friend, but he was now aware that anything could happen to him, like an attack by a crazed fan at any time. Although rejected earlier by Warner Brothers Records, George Harrison released his album Somewhere in England. It was another successful album. The album contained a song George wrote for John Lennon called All Those Years Ago. After recording Somewhere in England, George was basically a stay-at-home man. He would spend time with Olivia and Danny, tend to his garden, occasionally play the guitar, and just hang out with his friends. One of the best moments of George's life was when his lifelong idol, Carl Perkins, invited him to participate in the All-Star Jam in 1985. Being recently in another depression, it was surprising and very good to see George back on the stage, excited and joyful to be performing again. This happiness lasted for a while, for which his new album, Cloud9, was a medley full of fun, upbeat tunes. It turned out to be one of his best albums. When people would say that this was his comeback, he would respond by saying, "I've never left, I've been here the whole time." In April 1988, George got together with his friends Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. They were just hanging around jamming when, out of the blue, a song emerged. The song gave them an idea. Together, they formed the band The Traveling Wilburys. It was the first band George was in ever since the Beatles. In July 1997, George discovered a lump on the back of his neck. It turned out to be cancer. He got treated for it and it went away. but 6 months later he got throat cancer once again. On December 30th, 1999, a crazed fan broke into the Harrisons' home and stabbed George one time in the chest. However, George made light of the situation by joking about it. In early 2001, George began to feel fatigue. His symptoms got so bad that he eventually had to be hospitalized. On August 5th, an informal worldwide moment of prayer was organized in which people were encouraged to stop what they were doing at noon, chant Hare Krishna, and to play and sing My Sweet Lord as a giant get well card to George. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001. His cause of death was lung cancer. Immediately, the music world felt like something very valuable had been taken away from them. To respect George's wishes, he was immediately cremated and his ashes were immersed on the Ganges River. I chose George Harrison because even though he was shy, I knew that there was something that would make him tick, something that would keep him going, and that was essentially his powerful and passionate music.